3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Thank you, Joe Vallely. Joe didn't share with you that we started our journalistic careers right here in Huntsville at the beginning of the Space Shuttle program, when Joe himself was a reporter and I was a news anchor and a reporter covering NASA back in the early 80s, right after the Space Shuttle started to fly. So I am going to tell on you. Actually, it is my pleasure to be here today among this distinct panel. I have watched personally up close and from a couple of hours away some of the amazing work that they have had their hands in, their fingerprints on, starting back at the beginning of the programs for NASA, way back when I used to watch the Mercury, Gemini, all of the Apollo launches from my backyard or my roof, or when I sat on our front doorstep in Fort Lauderdale. I had a chance to be there last week and reminisce and think about all the wonderful times in my hometown watching what NASA has been able to do over the last 60 years. And in the last 36, up close and personal right here at the Marshall Space Flight Center and at the Cape. Again, we have a distinct group today, and it is my pleasure to let them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who they are, where they started here in Huntsville, and where they are today. Ladies? Teresa, you have the microphone.
Yeah, why don't I start? I'm Teresa Van Hooser, and I started, I'm originally from Johnson City, Tennessee, up in the northeast corner of Tennessee. I graduated from Tennessee Tech in 1980, and I graduated with an industrial engineering degree. Immediately after graduation, I came to work for NASA here at the Marshall Space Flight Center, and my career spanned 35 years. So I retired from Marshall about 4 years ago. During that time, I started my career in engineering, and then I moved to the project office and spent most of my time in the project management arena. I got my master's degree from University of Alabama, Huntsville, and I worked space lab programs. I worked International Space Station, and the Ares programs were the primary programs that I worked. And when I retired as the Deputy Center Director for the Marshall Space Flight Center. So I'll pass it on. Sandy, I'll let you go next.
Okay, I'm Sandy Coleman, and my NASA career really started when I was an 11-year-old Girl Scout. My dad worked at Redstone Arsenal, and he took my Girl Scout troop out to meet Dr. Werner von Braun. And this man just mesmerized me. It was amazing how he energized me to go to work in the space program. So when I graduated from high school, I managed to get a GS3 secretarial position at NASA Marshall. And I was in the accelerated math class, so my counselor said, well, you should go into accounting. Now, this is the late 60s, mid to late 60s. So I got an accounting degree, and when I went through the ranks at NASA to a GS-12, I realized that I really needed an engineering degree. So I had gotten my accounting degree from UAH. I did 2 years of prerequisites at UAH and got accepted into the master's program, industrial engineering program, and then received a sabbatical from Marshall to get my engineering degree, the master's degree in industrial engineering in Tuscaloosa. I was the first woman to be selected for full-time graduate study at Marshall, at NASA, Marshall, which was a big deal at that time. I worked initially in the Saturn program, so I was a part of the team. Even though I was a secretary at the time, I was a part of that team in 1969 that landed on the moon. Such a thrilling day, and shortly after that, I was one of 40 that was transferred to the Space Shuttle Task Team. So I was part of the original Space Shuttle Task Team for the selection of the prime contractors there. I worked in 3 of the 4 shuttle project offices through the years, and my last job was the external tank project manager after the Columbia accident. I also was the first chief operating officer at the National Space Science and Technology Center. So amazing career, amazing challenges. After I retired from NASA, I went to work for ATK, that then was Orbital ATK, and then Northrop Grumman. I just retired in December, so after 40 years at NASA and then 12 years in industry, I'm traveling.
Me next. Hi, my name is Lisa McCullum, and I've got to say I'm just tickled to be here on this panel with these accomplished ladies, so thank you for having me. I have been at NASA now for about 7 years, so I'm fairly new, I think, still learning a lot every day. I graduated from the University of Alabama in Huntsville in 2010 with an aerospace mechanical engineering degree, and during that time I did some co-oping at the Navistar engine plant that used to be here in town, if any of you locals remember that. So I kind of started off thinking I was going to go into cars, but then 2008 downturn happened and some things changed, and after I graduated I worked for a year as a contractor for a company called Cord Technologies as a contractor at the Missile Defense Agency doing future concept stuff, and got the opportunity to come over here for NASA. Been doing solid propulsion with some adventures into other areas ever since, and been having a great time.
All right. Well, I'm Mary Beth Coble. I started my career at NASA in 1986 after graduating from the University of Iowa in mechanical engineering. And I graduated from Iowa and moved to Alabama. I'd never been to the state before, so it was a new adventure for me. And I started my career in turbo machinery in the propulsion department, and I've been at NASA 33 years. And I still work in the propulsion department, only now I manage the department. And so I've done various jobs in propulsion. I've moved around to several different jobs, but I've stayed in the same organization in engineering my whole career, minus 1 year doing a procurement in the basement, which was an adventure. But anyway, and I've loved, when I moved here from Iowa, I thought I would go back to the Midwest and be closer to my family someday, but I loved my job so much. I've been here 33 years, and I can't imagine a better career.
Hi, my name is Benny Jacks, and I went to work for NASA in 1966, so I'm kind of older than all these other ladies up here on the stage, I'm sure. It was my honor to speak to you from the administrative side of the House. I graduated school in 1966, and back in those days, it wasn't required to have a degree to go to work for NASA or the Army. So they gave us a testing at our school, and if we passed it, then we automatically could choose a job at NASA or the Army. And so I happened to have chose NASA, went to work as a GS2 instead of a GS3. So back in those days, GS2 we were making a lot of money. And I was a travel and documents examiner when I first went to work in the administrative office. Dr. Heinberg and Tessman was my first boss, and Dr. Von Braun was the center director. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of NASA. I worked there for 45 years. I retired in 2011. I held a variety of jobs in the administrative side of the house, starting out as a travel and documents examiner. Then I became an administrative assistant. Following that, I became a secretary, and then I became I became a patent and documents examiner in the chief counsel's office. And after that position, that's when they originated the professional intern program, and so I applied and got accepted as a security specialist in the Center Operations Directorate. And after that, then I was selected by Jack Lee, who was the center director at the time, to become NASA's Real Property and Spatialization Officer. I kept up with all the buildings, places, and people at 5 installations, which included Marshall, Michoud, Slidell, Santa Susana, and Yellow Creek. After that, I became a management analyst in the Space Transportation Directorate, working for Denny Cross and Chris Singer. And then I became a business management analyst, working for Jan Davis and Steve Cash. So I've had a very lucrative career. So I'm speaking to you from the administrative side of the house. You do not have to be a scientist or an engineer to go to work for NASA. So I'm just privileged to be up here on stage with these ladies. I have worked with most of them all of my life. I retired in 2011, and then I came to the Space and Rocket Center and became the volunteer coordinator. And I'm recruiting volunteers and former retirees and civil service and contractors to come work with us and tell your stories here at the Space Center, because everybody you meet has a wonderful story, and they'll tell you all about their career.
And last but not least, I'm Angela Walker, or maybe last and least, I don't know. But anyways, I'm Angela Walker. I have been at Marshall Space Flight Center for this year would make my 32nd year. I am originally from Phoenix City, Alabama, which is a little southeast of Auburn, to give you perspective if you've never heard of Phoenix City. I graduated from Tuskegee Institute, now university, and actually it became university the year I graduated. So I actually have two diplomas, one that says Tuskegee Institute and one that says Tuskegee University, because my senior year is when it transitioned from an institute to a university. I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. Actually, right out of college, I went to work for Polaroid in Boston, Massachusetts. Never felt like home, wanted to get back to the South. Fell in love with someone who lived in the South. Really, that probably was the driving factor, if I'm honest. And so I came back. NASA offered me a job. It was an amazing opportunity. I never even applied for NASA. I don't know if it was serendipity, God, purpose, destiny, something. But NASA called me one day and offered me a job, not an interview. Mac Blackman said, hey, this is NASA. We want to know if you want to come work for us. Now, I later found out that someone had given them my application and my credentials. But long story short, I've been there now for 32 years. I've had some amazing opportunities, was able to be a NASA fellow, and attended Harvard Business School, not Harvard School, Kennedy. Most NASAians go to the government school, which is Kennedy, but I had an opportunity to go to the business school and received an executive certificate from Harvard Business School. I worked shuttle 19 years of my career, from return to flight, 51L, up until I was transitioned off of shuttle to work Ares, our new space rocket. I was in Safety and Mission Assurance Organization. Actually, when I started, it was called Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance Organization, SR and QA. It later became Safety and Mission Assurance. I spent 19 years there, moved up into management in SNMA. Then I went from there to the Chief Engineer's office. I was Deputy Chief Engineer for the Space Shuttle propulsion elements. From there, I was Division Chief, a manager building the upper stage for Ares in-house, managing as a Division Chief the Systems Engineering and Integration Group. I've been stuck with that title for a while, and now I was the Systems Engineer and Integration Division Lead for the Space Launch System. And so I've been working that for the last 8 years until about 4 months ago. I have been blessed to now be a part of the senior executive employees at Marshall. Woohoo, that's a big thing. And I am the Deputy Department Manager for the Spacecraft and Vehicle Systems Department, primarily focusing on large launch vehicles. The Space Launch System, CC, that's Commercial Crew Vehicle, and hopefully landers and gateways soon.
I'm listening to the panel. You all have undergraduate degrees, masters, doctorates, PhDs. Benny, you have a high school diploma. In the 60s, what was that like? Did you automatically at 18 years old look for a job and get on with Marshall immediately. What does that story tell to these young people here today?
Oh, again, back in the day, you didn't have to have a degree to go to work for NASA. I was in the typing class and in the shorthand class, and so they came out and gave testing capabilities to us. I think it was Alverson Drone, and so if you passed those tests, you automatically got considered to go to work for NASA or the Army. You could choose either one of those job opportunities that was being presented to us. And so I didn't even have second thoughts about doing it. When they told me that I was going to be going to work for NASA, I'm like, wow, a little girl from Gurley, Alabama. You know, I'm a girly girl. But hey, it was just an awesome experience to go out there and then to know that Dr. Werner von Braun was the center director and all the Germans had just migrated to Huntsville from Fort Bliss. It was, I mean, you didn't even have a second thought about going to work for NASA. And then at the time, we all worked together as a team. The people brought me into the office, and even though I didn't know anything about NASA at the time or what to do, we all worked together as a team, and they just taught us what we needed to do. I had some great mentors along the way, or else I would not have succeeded. We had what they called OJT, on-the-job training, and it was just a wonderful job. I didn't even entertain going to work for anyone else.
So you always wanted to work for
I
NASA.
always wanted to work for NASA.
But the rest of you were accidental NASA engineers or NASA scientists, correct? Correct. Did anybody grow up and really say, I want to go there?
Me?
Except for Benny. It just happened. You did. And it was pivotal for you the day that you actually attended Marshall with your Girl Scout troop?
Yes, as I said earlier, my dad took my Girl Scout troop out, and and this is when Dr. von Braun was on the Army side. It was before NASA, because NASA wasn't established until 1960. But all through high school, I followed him, and when NASA was established, it was like, man, that's what I want to do. And I was in the accelerated math class, the only girl in the accelerated math class. There were like 20 of us, you know, that were in that class. I studied really hard because I thought it took math, but nobody ever told me I could be an engineer. I didn't know what an engineer was, frankly.
So for you two who were there almost at the beginning, in the early 60s, what was that like to be a woman? You've described it being the only person in your advanced math class. What was it like? What was the environment like for a woman?
Everybody just enjoyed working together and learning together, and we had a job to do. We were mandated in 1960 by the president to go to the moon, and so that was the goal. And everybody just did their job. And
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the same way. We had so much to do. We were so busy. We really didn't think about anything except just that goal of going to the moon. So we were all focused on one goal. There was no dissension. All of NASA was focused on going to the moon. And we, even though I was a secretary at the time, I mean, I had huge responsibilities. We didn't have computers for filing. I mean, it was very important for me to make sure that everything was filed. I mean, I worked really hard, and I was a part of the team, and we all worked as a team. It didn't feel like that we were discriminated against in any
Nope, not
way.
at all.
No, we were part of that team that was necessary.
The Saturn sorority,
that's right.
right? You talked about how difficult it was that you had to watch everything and do everything by hand. How many of you have a cell phone, iPhone? Everybody, right? Yeah. What was it like? We're so used to using computers now. You all came on when they were using slide rules, correct? And computers were half the size of this room. How did you do anything? I mean,
We worked 24/7.
How did it happen?
We had typewriters, and then we had to take shorthand. We had to transcribe all of the meetings, and we did their travel orders. We did their award ceremonies, just a variety of things, from the women's standpoint. And we also went and got their coffee, which we were not offended to have to go take them coffee or to go buy their lunch, because they were on a mission to go accomplish this goal, and everybody worked together.
And that's important to think about stenography. I mean, we were taking notes. I mean, I was a and then you would go type those up.
Yeah, you'd have to take them real time during the meeting,
Yeah.
or then
By
we would have-
hand?
By hand. Oh, yes,
Yes.
shorthand.
Yes.
I still know
And then we
some
had
of
the
strokes.
typewriters, so.
And then transcribe it to a typewriter, and then mimeograph it?
Absolutely. And it had to be perfect. We could not make any mistakes. Even if
Yeah.
there were any mistakes, you had to correct every copy that you had to type up. So.
See, if you
it
were
was-
making like 8 copies or 5 copies and you made a mistake, you would
You'd
pull
have to
all those
correct
little,
all.
you would correct all of those little mistakes. I mean, you guys have no idea. And one other thing I'll add about computers, Marshall Space Flight Center got computers in 1984, our first PCs. Desk computers, and I got one. There were 5. I got one of the 5 because I was in the Solid Rocket Booster Project Office.
That
and
was
my-
only 35 years ago.
yeah.
Think about that.
But we
We've been
did
to the moon
not
by then.
have desk computers at that time, and I put our Solid Rocket Booster budget on that computer that year. I was the only one in shuttle, and we used it as a trial to, I had a programmer sitting right with me programming, adding up all of the line items in the budget, in the Thicol budget. So just another tidbit that was memories.
And a lot of that went on through the 80s, like in 85, because when I worked in the Patent and Documents office, or the Chief Counsel's office, the lawyers would transcribe on a machine, and then they would bring it into our office, and then we'd have to type up all of their notes. So up until the 80s, we kept doing that.
Something else that was different was the dress code.
Absolutely.
Back when they started in the 60s. Notice how many women up here are wearing pants. That hasn't always been the case at NASA. Tell us about the memo that went out that actually allowed you to wear pants to work.
Well, I'll talk this one. In it was either the late 70, the last of the end of 69 or 70 when we got this memo saying that we could wear pants, and it was the day of pantsuits. So before that, there were jeans and slacks, but all of a sudden the dress code was pantsuits, and so matching blazer suits. And there was a big discussion at NASA on whether or not the women, that we could wear those pantsuits to work. And they finally decided, so we got the memo, and then we all started wearing pants. It was really a big day. You guys have no idea.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
Big deal.
Tell us about, for all of you, what was your experience like when you started, no matter when you started at Marshall?
So I started in 1980, and I was the only female in my branch, which was probably, I want to say, 15 or 20 people. I don't really remember exactly. And they hadn't hired new employees in a long time because they had a big layoff after the Apollo program. And so during the 1980 is when they first started hiring anybody outside of their co-ops. And a co-op is like an internship with NASA, and that was the only people they hired. And so that year is why I got to work for NASA. They started hiring a lot more employees to build up for working the shuttle. And so for me, they treated me almost like a daughter. So there was such a gap in the generation of when the last folks that were hired versus when I came in, and there was a lot of us that came in during that time frame. And I'll have to say, they wanted to take me to every meeting. They wanted to take me on site tours, and they wanted, anytime they had someplace to go or something different, they were always wanting to take me along and show me, and this youngster that doesn't have a clue what's going on, and we're going to figure out, we're going to train her our way. And so I'll have to say that it was great for me. It was great to have the kind of support, and I really never felt like that I wasn't included, and in fact, probably overly included. It was almost like a competition of who could take me to see the most exciting thing on the job.
So I started in '86, and it was right after Challenger. And so Challenger accident happened in January of 1986, and then starting that summer, we hired a ton of people. I think when I came in, like 10 people were hired the same day I was, which is a lot. I mean, and they were hiring like that every week at the time. And so there was tons of new folks come into NASA at the time I started. And so what was great about that was there was all kinds of people my age, right? So when you started at work, not only did you have work to do, but then there was all kinds of people to socialize with in the evenings, which was a great thing. And so we started in propulsion, a propulsion lab activities group where we would plan get-togethers and socials for the new employees to try to get people to feel a part of the team. And so we called it PLAG because we have an acronym for everything, Propulsion Lab Activities Group. And I was one of the first people to be on that. And we organized lunchtime speakers and evening, we'd all go to a movie or volunteer at an event, and so that was a great way. And NASA at the time also had like co-ed softball leagues and co-ed volleyball leagues and all kinds of extracurricular things to help you not only feel a part of the team at work, but also in the evening. But I'll just add one thing. I tell folks today when I mentor, my first day at work, I kind of accidentally got assigned to Turbo Machinery. I had interviewed, at the time NASA didn't fly you in for an interview, so I'd done a phone interview from Iowa, and I had interviewed in a systems analysis group and a Turbo Machinery group, and NASA offered me both jobs, and I got to choose. And so I felt more secure coming out of school doing systems analysis. It was 1D kind of fluids modeling. And so I said, I'll take the systems analysis job. And I show up my first day, and they swear you in. You put your hand, and you swear you're going to, do what the government does. Right?
No, tell us. What takes place that first day? I think a lot of us don't know.
Well, you sign a whole bunch of paper. You spend half a day signing forms. And back in the day, it was paper forms, and you had to sign your, put your name and birth date, and, page after page. How many hours? Yeah, fingerprints. You had to get fingerprints taken. You have to swear in a Bible that you're going to abide the laws of the United States. They have a swearing in with a flag. And anyway, I get all done with that. It was from 8 to 11 or 12, right? And they said, okay, and the human resources person said, okay, you're reporting to Lauren Gross in Turbo Machinery. And I'm like, oh, no, you got that job wrong. I picked the systems analysis job. And the human resources person said, it says right here, Turbo Machinery. And I'm like, I know nothing about Turbo Machinery. What's happening to me? So they took me to report to Lauren Gross, who was my first boss, and I said, hey, I think there was a mix-up. I picked the other job offer. And he said, oh, I know, but I'm from Iowa too, and I wanted you to work for me, so I traded for you. Which freaked me out because I called my mother that night and said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do turbo machinery. I'm not mechanical. I'm fluids. I got the wrong job. And she told me, suck it up. True story. So anyway, but it was a great thing for me. That job was a way better fit for me, but I just kind of happened into it. So I tell folks, sometimes you just got to try a job. But that job fit my personality and skills way better. An analyst at NASA spends a lot of time on the computer all day, all day on the computer. And I know some of you might think that sounds like fun. I think that sounds terrible. So luckily, Turbo Machinery jobs require you to work with a whole bunch of different disciplines and integrate that, and you spend your day talking to a whole bunch of people, which to me sounded great. So it turned out perfect for me, but I kind of happened into my career.
But Mary Beth, you mentioned about the team building, working together with all those brand new employees. It was at a very pivotal moment for this country and for NASA to return to flight.
Oh, yeah.
You all were in a stressful situation.
Right.
Was the team building just to get to know each other, or was it also to try to come to grips with what had happened, what was happening, and how to move forward.
Yeah, so when you're 21, however it was 86, 22, when you first come to work, you think, oh, this is just about me having fun. But I'm sure upper management was starting those activities groups and that kind of thing as a bonding to help us do our jobs better. I realize that now as a manager, but I'm pretty sure back then I was only interested in meeting people. So it's funny how your perspective changes from, a student right out of school and what you think, and then what it's like when you've been there a while.
In the real world.
Yeah.
Angie, you wanted to pick up on that.
So yeah, I came to work about 8 or so months after Mary Beth. I came in September of '87, and again, it was in the crux of getting ready to return to flight, right? So there was the excitement in the air. There was a lot of work. We didn't talk a lot about what had happened. We looked forward to what was going to happen. So the talk was more about, we're going to fly, we're going to return, we will do this again, we will be stronger, we will be better, we will not have another accident, it will not happen again on our watch. And that's kind of how we combed through every piece of paper. We looked at every safety analysis. We did what we call failure modes and effects. We looked at every piece of hardware and said, what could go wrong? When would it go wrong? How would it go wrong? And we put what we call retention rationale, right? We put intentionally into our FEMA seals, into our failure modes and effects analysis, retention rationale from design to manufacturing to operations, what we were going to do to prevent what happened on Challenger from ever happening again on our watch. So there were long days, long nights, lots of travel, lots of bonding. And what also happened at that time, while there were always African Americans, I say always, I'm assuming always, there were African Americans at Marshall, but in that 86, 87 time frame, affirmative action was big. Politically, that's what was going on with the political climate. And so like when I graduated from school, I had 3 job offers, and none was NASA. I didn't even talk to NASA because I had so many other opportunities as an African-American engineer who had a high GPA, right? And so I had opportunities that I didn't even look at NASA, but NASA brought me back to the South. And really, NASA was where I was destined to be always. So a year after graduating, I was back at NASA, but not only did I come in, there were several other African Americans who hired on around that same periodicity, around that same time. And so not only were we a part of the intramural teams that Mary Beth, I played softball, I remember I was on the softball team. So not only were there tennis teams and softball teams and other intramural teams that made us group, there were also some cultural teams. So I would get together with other African Americans and we would talk about what it's like to be at NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center. And so I remember going back to the computer discussion, even in '87, I guess computers you say came on in '84, even in '87, people were still leery about using their computers, right? Even in '87, they weren't using them a whole lot. People were still transitioning from slide rules and using our calculators.
We didn't get them at home until 86 or 87.
Right.
I mean, NASA was at the forefront. But
right.
A lot of people didn't
But
have
a lot of old
experience.
school was still there, so they weren't comfortable with the machines yet, and so it was still a time of transitioning. I think that's what I remember most about when I came on. It was a season of transitioning back to flying, transitioning for picking up a more diverse workforce, a younger workforce. So it was just a time of change, but it was good. It was all good.
You brought it up. You brought up the Challenger disaster, and then there was another one, and there was one prior with Apollo 1. You all have lived at NASA through different generations. How did you live not only with those fatal accidents, but with the transition, with the shutdown of the programs, the cancellation of Apollo, the cancellation of Shuttle, the cancellation of the Aries program. How did that work? Teresa, you're on.
So it just so happened that I was the acting manager of the Aries program when it got canceled.
Bring everybody up to speed, what
So
that was and
Aries-
how it had already launched. I mean, it was,
Yeah, so
It was airborne.
Aries was the precursor. It was post-shuttle, but pre-SLS. So the Space Launch System is kind of an iteration past the Aries. Aries was going to have 2 rockets. It was going to have one, we called Aries 1, that was going to the space station and to do the resupplies. Then we had the Aries 5, which was the bigger rocket, which is what the SLS is now, that was going to take us beyond low Earth orbit. And so it was not politically supported during that time, and so there was a lot of, when it got initiated, there was a lot of selling going on to Congress and a lot of selling to the people on Capitol Hill to get the Aries program off. And so we did, and we were well on our way, and we had flown a demonstration mission. The Aries 1X is what we called it. And it was successful. Everybody was doing great, working hard, and nobody had, I'll say nobody in the working troops, which included me, had any idea that the cancellation was coming. And when the budget got rolled out, it had Aries canceled. So it was devastating news to the team. It was devastating news to Huntsville because it was a lot of jobs. And so we immediately went into a recovery mode. There was tons of people who were not going to have jobs because of the cancellation. We had thousands of people that were working on the Aries program. And so part of my job at that time was then how do we transition out of those contracts? How do we get people the training they need to do other jobs? How do we move forward beyond this? And how do we get anybody to trust us again that they're going to want to go do another launch vehicle mission? So the big thing coming into the Space Launch System was, are people going to buy in? Are they really going to want to work it? Are we going to be able to move forward and do another launch vehicle? And NASA employees and their contractors are very resilient folks, and they never give up. And they believe in the mission. They believe in going to low Earth orbit and beyond. And so I think we didn't give them all the credit we should have. But they did. They stood with us, and a lot of folks were brought back on. I mean, there was a gap between the end of the Aries program and the start of the SLS. But we got there, and a lot of those folks are working the program today, and we needed their expertise to be able to go forward.
I can add a little to that as well. I was working I had already left NASA, and I was working in Washington at the time. And, you know, I think if it had not been for Senator Shelby and a lot of the Alabama delegation, we would not have the Space Launch System program. He was just amazing in helping us to transition those contracts because they put passed legislation that you couldn't cancel the contracts. And so now those contracts were just flowed into the SLS. So he basically, I think, saved the program. One other thing, if you mentioned the closeout of the Saturn program. So I was a part of after we landed on the moon, I was on the original Space Shuttle task team. So that was at the end of '69. And those of us that were transferred over to Shuttle were thinking, what's the big deal? You know, after in like 72, 73, when they said, well, we're going to cancel the Saturn program and it's going to be Space Shuttle. And those of us at the time said, well, what's the big deal? We're going to have a shuttle program, you know. And if you go forward now many, many years and you look at the SLS, I mean, Dr. von Braun had it right. He had put, with some of his drawings, he had put solid rocket boosters on Saturn with the hope that we could take that vehicle to Mars. And I mean, he was just ahead of his time. It's just amazing to look back at his work. But, we're getting there. We've had, of course, this International Space Station, the space shuttle missions. I mean, we've had significant success with that. But if you look at the transition of where we were and, where we maybe could have been and maybe already on Mars if we had continued with the Saturn program.
There were so many, though, changes that happened. The cancellation of the Saturn program ended. It was 6 or 7 years before shuttle actually started to fly. What was going on in Huntsville? I mean, there was the dry moment there, then there was the dry moment after Ares, then there has been quite a dry moment after the shuttle program retirement. What did you all do to try personally at Marshall to try to invigorate each other, support each other, and spread the word in the community that you will survive, that NASA will survive, that we will continue space exploration?
I'll just add a little bit more to that. After the Challenger accident, I was in the Solid Rocket Booster Project office at the time, I was the integration subsystem manager working for Larry Malloy in the Solid Rocket Booster office. And of course, it was almost like the mission to the moon. We were so busy. Within NASA, it was just, we've got to get the solid rocket booster redesigned. We have to get back to flying. And then after the Columbia accident, ended up being the external tank project manager. I was the deputy propulsion manager at the time of the accident, and then became the external tank project manager. And it was almost, again, just like Saturn, almost like the moon mission. You're so intent on getting back to flight that that's the only thing that within NASA that you're thinking about. I know there were a lot of other things happening with, I know during the 2 shutdowns there were a lot of people, probably contractors were laid off because you could not continue the work. But at NASA, I think it was like going to the moon. It was like getting the shuttle back up after Challenger. We were so busy, we didn't have time to think about much else.
And I think sometimes in those downtimes we focus on, well, what technologies do we need for that next mission? How can we get started and be more prepared for when the next program starts? So like in engineering, we double down and say, well, what was hard with the last program? What are we missing? Oh, we need this new technology, or we need a valve that leaks less, or we need combustion device that has a longer life. And we kind of look inward sometimes too and work on those technologies we're going to need for future missions. And so we get a little more innovative maybe and do a little more research and development during those downtimes until when your program's busy and you're trying to fly, you don't have much time to do technology. You're just trying to get hardware out the door into the launch pad. But in those times between programs, I think NASA has done a great job on focusing on technologies for the future and really trying to use the workforce that's there in the best way possible.
And who amongst you is now working on the next big challenge, nuclear propulsion?
So our department's working a little on nuclear propulsion, and which is there's a lot to work on. So there's lots of technologies there, both in the materials for that, in long duration cryogenic storage, and you basically are using a nuclear reactor as your combustion chamber. And so how do you do that integration between the reactor and a traditional rocket engine? So there's lots of work to do there. There's lots of challenges. The temperatures are a challenge. The duration of we're used to working on short duration firings. These nuclear rockets fire for a long time. But it's a little, bearings, you have to run them longer and slower, right? And so there's all kinds of technologies to work on. And so we're working really collaboratively between propulsion and the materials folks and some test folks to try to test out those technologies for those next missions.
Pioneering technology.
Pioneering technologies.
Do you all consider yourselves pioneers? Many do. You're nodding. Yes. Yes. I've seen people say, no, I never thought
You don't
about
really
what
think
I'm
of
doing.
yourself as, as anything special.
You kind of look back and go,
That makes us sound old, so we don't want to do that. We don't consider
okay.
ourselves pioneers.
No
'cause we
Laura
don't-
Ingalls among us, right?
Yeah, Lisa might be a pioneer.
I don't know that I consider myself personally a pioneer, but every day I come to work and I'm surrounded by really smart people, and that's really humbling in a lot of ways, and it's really thrilling in a lot of other ways. So people working on things like nuclear propulsion, electric propulsion, you know, all kinds of innovative materials, new architectures for, you know, Gateway and going to the moon and things like that. So I don't think I'm personally going to have some great big bright light bulb over my head that turns me into the next great inventor, but I can help move that process forward, and I consider that really inspiring.
Okay, I'll ask a different way. How did the women who came before you lay the path for you today? What difference was there? Was there a mentor you had to get you where you are today?
Oh, absolutely. And as I look back, you know, I realized that many mentors were there when I didn't realize what they were doing. Even in college, you know, I had, you know, especially women, but also men kind of reach out to me, and they could see in me qualities that I couldn't necessarily see in myself, and encourage me to develop those and to take different paths that would lead me where I am today. And at Marshall, I think women especially do such a great job of seeing somebody that has the potential, but maybe not the confidence just yet, to go off and do something, and they will reach out, you know, even when I don't have the courage to reach up. And so I think over time I've gained that a little bit, but realizing now that that's what's happened, I do think it's important, even for younger folks like myself, to continue to reach out to newer employees, to interns, to students, and keep that an ongoing process.
So, yes, there are people on this panel that were mentors to me. Teresa was a huge mentor when she was director of engineering, deputy director of engineering, actually. And I always felt like I could go and talk to Teresa because she had come up through the ranks. You know, she came up as probably a GS7 engineer, and it made her way all the way to a senior executive. And so sometimes formal, sometimes informal, sometimes pulling, sometimes being pushed. You know, sometimes she would call and say, we think you should do this. We think you should consider this. I remember when I was in SNMA, it was the engineering side of the house that kind of pulled me out of SNMA and said, hey, girl, you need some broadening. We're going to put you in engineering. And by the way, you're going to be the deputy chief engineer for Space Shuttle. But it wasn't such a stretch for me because I had been working kind of semi as a systems engineer. I think that's what SNMA mission assurance engineers are. And I had been a systems engineer in SNMA for 19 years, and I had worked every element in shuttle except external tank, and I supported external tank during the Columbia investigation.
For the kids here, the students, explain what that means for quality assurance and systems engineering. Truly, you know, from stem to stern, from aft. What do you have to know about a rocket?
It's
Everything.
It's everything. It's kind of like that jack of all trades, and maybe not a specialist or discipline specialist of any one form of engineering. So I was familiar with all of the interfaces of the launch vehicle, you know, how one element connected to the other element. I was familiar with all of the run times, the operation times. In fact, Mary Beth said that she worked in turbo machinery. I spent 3 years at Pratt & Whitney developing the alternate turbo pumps for the Space Shuttle main engines. So, and in SNMA, in mission assurance, as the quality rep, you needed to know the quality of every part. So not only was I familiar with the design and was involved in the verification and qualification and certification, that only means that we had to make sure the design was good before we released it to the guys to build it, to manufacture it, right? So I was a part of that process, making sure the design was good, making sure we had done the analysis, checking the analysis, and then I was a part of the manufacturing, saying this is where you need to have inspectors watching and looking over somebody's shoulder, because this feature of the design is very critical. So I was a part of that. So involving myself in the build process as well as the design process just made me more familiar with tip to tail, right? From design to build to operation. And so I was able to transition out of the systems organization that knows something about everything and not an expert on, I hate to say it, anything, but systems, to becoming a chief engineer that makes decisions on critical features on the design, and when it was okay, when we ventured from those critical features, was the hardware still good to fly? And standing before the flight readiness committees and the project managers and saying to them, we've done everything, we've closed every piece of paper, we've looked at every drawing, and we're good from an engineering perspective, and before then, from a safety and mission assurance perspective, we stood before project managers like Sandy and said, your vehicle is ready to go.
Did you get that, boys and girls, how that works? You know, a rocket, just because it's built, doesn't fly after it's designed. What Angie is saying is it goes through so many steps before it actually gets to the launch pad and then lifts off. They have to know exactly not only what's going on in their little area of the world on that rocket, but everything. She had to know, and many others up here had to know how everything worked. It's important, especially if something went wrong. Who has questions? Anybody have questions right now? We're about 50 minutes into our program. Please stand up, tell us your name, and tell us what your question is. I'll walk around to you. Hang on one second. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and your question.
My name's Sam. I'm from Sydney, Australia. This might.
Hi, Sam, from Sydney, Australia.
Hi.
Welcome to America and Huntsville, Alabama.
Thank you. This might sound like a bit silly question, but what does Marshall mean? Like, you know, you're all saying, you know, you're from Marshall. What does that really mean?
So that's not silly at all, and we just assume that everybody knows. So NASA has 10 centers that make up the whole NASA, and so the Marshall Space Flight Center is one of those centers. Its primary responsibility from an agency perspective is the propulsion systems, and so that's where the smoke and fire of the agency. So if you pick the Johnson Space Center, is another one of those 10. They do predominantly the flight operations and the crew training and all the astronauts. If you talk about the Kennedy Space Center, the Kennedy Space Center really does the launches from there. And then we have multiple science centers. Most of this panel, because I guess I didn't, when I was trying to pick who all to be on the panel, you can't cover everything that we do at the center. We do lots of science also, but a lot of the centers are predominantly science centers or research centers. So NASA covers the breadth of human space flight all the way through deep space exploration and all kinds of things. And so Marshall is the center that's here in Huntsville, Alabama. And so all of us came from the Marshall Space Flight Center. And did you want to add?
I was just going to add in, every NASA center is named after somebody.
Yes.
So Marshall's named after George C. Marshall, who was a general, I believe, was a general. Kennedy was named after John F. Kennedy, who was a U.S. president. So each center is named after Johnson. Was named after
President
Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson. So every center is named after some famous or influential person. So Goddard. Glenn
Ames,
and Glenn,
John
and
Glenn.
Cleveland is John Glenn. So anyway, ours just happens to be George C. Marshall, and he was a general. in the military.
Brian Odom, remind us, this is the Marshall historian. George C. Marshall was not only a general, but he is most famous for the Marshall.
Yeah. He was Secretary of State, so he was the organizer for the American effort in World War II, but he was also, after that, responsible for rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan.
There you go, rebuilding Europe in the Marshall Plan. So Marshall was the very first center here for the country that began to design and develop and execute President Kennedy's mission to fly to the moon. So it all started here, so it starts here. They also have the Michoud Assembly Facility, where actually the building takes place down on the water in New Orleans. And then it goes down to the Kennedy Space Center where it flies, and once it lifts off, the Johnson Space Center takes over. But then it comes back to Marshall because they kind of manage the science on board the International Space Station. So it gets a little convoluted along the
Very much
way,
so, yeah.
but every center has a little piece of this space action. And the weather, the National Weather Service, NOAA, there's so much that goes on at Marshall. There's SEVERE. You've heard of SEVERE in Australia? SEVERE means serve in español, se habla español. It means serve in Spanish. And it actually, well, I'll let the deputy director, retired, tell us about what SEVERE does.
Thanks, Liz. I appreciate that. Basically, is it goes into a lot of countries that you can't. Basically, what it does is it helps monitor the weather and helps monitor the flooding. It's got a whole lot of technology that keeps these countries knowing when floods may occur so that they can protect themselves and move to higher grounds. And they've put that at a lot of different countries now that are included as a part of that. So
Especially third world countries.
third world countries is
that
mostly
may not
where it's
have the
at.
technology to know weather's there. And it's also able to use and see historically
Right.
archaic finds that, from Pompeii, from, thousands of years ago. It's pretty amazing what they do out there.
And Liz, let me give a plug to Brian, because all these pictures that you see here, he put together for us and dug through the archives to be able to have that for you. So there's lots of pictures to get through, and by no means did we capture everybody, but it just gives you a little bit of a flavor of the Marshall women that have had some prominent roles in getting us where we are today. And for those of us that are sitting here, a lot of them were the ones that helped us to be able to do the jobs that we're doing or did at the center, and kind of pave that way. But that, I think there's the one picture of Ann McNair, who was originally on the panel and couldn't join us, but she was the first female engineering supervisor at the Marshall Space Flight Center. So it's people like Ann that that pushed through some of those, what they call the glass ceilings, if you will, and made it easier for us, and we continue to do that for the next generation. And things that don't even seem to you like a big deal then were a big deal. A female being a supervisor over men just didn't happen. And so she had to push really hard to say, why not? And so there's all kinds of stories like that allowed, by them taking on those battles, if you will, then it made it much easier for those of us that came behind them, that it really wasn't even a question. Of course, women can supervise men supervise women. What's the difference? So I think that's a critical part. But I just wanted to give Brian a shout out, because he helped me a lot in putting these together.
Very important. I thank you, Brian, too. The world you all have lived in, you've never known a time when there weren't rockets flying and people living in space. But it's these women who I said earlier have had their thumbprints, their fingerprints at the forefront of the space program for the world, starting back in the early 60s up to today, making groundbreaking efforts to keep us flying and to keep the exploration alive, because that is very important, isn't it? Who else has a question? Yes, ma'am. stand up and tell us, are you from Australia too? Okay, just asking. Who are you?
Cheryl Austin.
Hi, Cheryl Austin. Your question?
You know how nowadays everyone's influenced by movies and media. What I'm reminded of is the movie Hidden Figures. And that's sort of what my impression had been of women in NASA. But I have heard many of you say already that you did not experience discrimination, and if anything, you experienced a lot of mentorship. But just in this last answer, you said that having a woman supervising a man was unheard of. Did you also have situations like we saw in Hidden Figures, where maybe you were actually the author of some work and maybe they decided to leave your name off of the publication, or maybe you can describe some other situations?
Did you have to run 2 miles to the bathroom? If you all saw that movie that took place at a space center in Virginia, they had to run to the ladies' bathroom because when it started, there were no ladies' bathrooms because there were no ladies at work there.
So I started in 1965, and others. I worked at the headquarters building, and we definitely had a women's restroom on my floor, very equal to the men's. I was always pulled in we had so many issues. I was always pulled in to help solve those problems. So even in the early 70s, when I was on the Space Shuttle Task Team, and I had gotten out of the secretarial field by that time, I was included. I was on the External Tank Source Evaluation Board for the selection of Martin Marietta as the Space Shuttle prime contractor, and on the orbiter contract, I went to JSC and was on that orbiter SEB for selection of Rockwell. So I really didn't see that discrimination. If it was there, I guess I was blinded by it. There had not been a space shuttle business manager within the 4 shuttle project offices. And Porter Bridwell, bless his heart, he selected me. He had come through our project office as training for the senior executive service, and he recognized that I had potential, and so he gave me that opportunity. I was the first woman to get to be a GS-14 business manager in the space shuttle program. Those jobs had always been handled by a man, filled by a man, and one of the things I never will forget, he told me, he said, you better not fail because, you're going to fail all women. And so my biggest deal was not to fail, to work really, really hard so that I didn't let the team down. But, there were always so many opportunities. It was, they educated me. So I really just did not see the discrimination, at least in the 60s and 70s, that it was always, I worked really, really hard to make sure I didn't let the team down.
So if you recall, it wasn't the ladies' restroom that they were running to. They were running to the colored ladies' restroom. So that's an important distinction, is that the discrimination that African Americans felt may have been totally different from what the experience of the majority females was. And so that's important. Me personally, I don't have any experiences where I didn't get the credit for my work. I did when I initially hired in. Again, remember I told you how I hired in. They just basically called, looking at my resume, and offered me a job. They didn't immediately put me on shuttle, right? When I first came in, they put me on what they call Verval. If you don't remember, there was a company that did internal work at NASA. They were like the machine shop. And they said, you're going to be the quality engineer for the machine shop. And I went over and met the team. They primarily supported, at that time, the test area. And I remember going over and introducing myself to the team and saying, hey, I'm here and I'm going to be your quality engineer. They looked at me They looked at each other and they said, "Oh, really? Well, where did you go to school?" And I told them that I went to Tuskegee. And they said, "Oh, you went to that peanut school." That was the response I got. So I said, because I have always been one of agility, mental agility, I said, most certainly, that was Dr. George Washington Carver, who discovered over 300 and some items from a sweet potato and over 400 and some items from a peanut.
And?
So instead of that being a comment that said you were from a lesser school, it became, no, it's a comment of people who took minimal, a peanut and a sweet potato, and created products that made life better, not just for African Americans, but for all people. And so I was able to flip the conversation from one that started off being negative to one that was positive. And I think that's how I survived. So I wasn't with the Verval team very long, in fact, probably about 3 months. And they put me on shuttle because they recognized that I had maybe some of the gifts that it took to support work that was important as the Space Shuttle program. So have there been other instances? One thing about, if I may just say this, and then I'll pass the mic, one thing about being an African American at Marshall in the very early days, and maybe to some extent even today, you either have hyper visibility. Everybody notices you, everybody sees you because you stick out, right? Or you're invisible. Nobody notices you, no one sees you because you're different. And so what I had to learn and what others like me have learned is how to manage both hyper visibility as well as invisibility and not let those two phenomena or two truths impact your ability or our ability to contribute. So yes, but we're strong, we're resilient, and we press on. Just like the ladies in Hidden Figure, right?
Teresa, what was it like for you? You brought it up. You supervised men early on, and others of you have supervised men. How did that work? Was it a difficult transition, or was it something just very organic and very natural? And did they take it well?
Yeah, so for me, it was mostly very organic, and so it was really no different. You didn't supervise a female different when you supervise a male. The way I like to say that I supervise people was individually, because every person is different and needs different things, and you manage them differently. So you can't go, it's just like you can't raise your kids the same way because they need different things and have different personalities. It's the same way with employees. And so what I try to do is to do it on an individual basis based on what their desires were, what their skill sets were, what is it that they needed from me to be able to do their job the best. And so I think once you can have that conversation with the employees, is they realize that you are there for them, regardless of whether you're male or female, that you're just there to do the job the best way that you know how. It was harder for me from an age perspective than it was from a male-female perspective. So managing people who were older than me, because I moved up pretty quickly into a supervisory project management type position. So it was harder for me managing this more senior employees because they kind of looked at me like, okay, well, did you get this job because you deserved it, or did you get this job because you're a female? And so a lot of times it was, do you have to prove yourself? And that, you just take with a grain of salt and you do the best job you can do and treat them the same way you treat everybody else. And
Men supported you. That's
Yes.
their problem.
That's their problem.
Their problem.
I mean, if they don't like it, they can go find someplace else to work.
Men supported you all the way up the ranks. And then they didn't support you with a very important professional decision that you made a few years back. Tell the folks in this room where you were as the number 2 person at the Marshall Space Flight Center and the decision that you made.
So, I mentioned to you that I retired about almost 4 years ago now. And so I got, I was at the right age and I had the number of years in, and had already said that I was going to retire, and then I was asked to come and be the deputy director by Patrick Sherman, who was the center director at that time. And I said, sure, I'll be glad to. I promise you I'll give you 2 years, but then that's, then I'm probably going to retire. And so I think he had the anticipation that, yeah, I'll loop her in here, and then, when I decide to leave, then she can, then you'll be okay to come be the center director. So Patrick and I talked a lot, obviously, being the center director and deputy, and found out that he was going to leave the agency, and so I made sure that I exited before he did. And it really was a personal decision. One, it was a personal decision for me that it was time, and I had aging parents that lived in East Tennessee that I really wanted to spend time with. There were a lot of circumstances, and it was not the job that I really wanted, because I love working with people and mentoring people and helping people career-wise. And the director job is an up-and-out job. It's a very political job. You're doing all kinds of things, meetings on the Hill, selling programs, and that wasn't what I thought was something that I wanted to do at the end of my career. I wanted to go out in a job that I loved. I loved being the deputy director, and I was happy as a lark working that position. But it was time. I had had a phenomenal career up until that time, and wouldn't change any of it, and wouldn't change my decision that I made at that time. And it was the right decision for me, even though that I had folks come and say, just hang on, just hang on. But you have to make decisions that are right for you. You're the one that's responsible for your own career and for where you're going to go and what you want to do, not somebody else.
You all led me into a perfect question where you talked about work-life balance. My dad was the oldest living Delta Airlines captain when he passed away, and he met my mother, 10,000 feet up, as a Delta Airlines stewardess back then. So she got married, and Delta Airlines forced her to quit. For you all, you started to work in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and raise children and continue America's space program. How did you do all that, all of you, in a day and time for each of you in the 60s, 70s, 80s? And I don't know if you've known anything like that. I mean, you may have encountered that, but for those of you who were even early on, was it a challenge? How did you do it? They didn't have daycares. What happened back then?
I mean, I had my mom, and my husband was a realtor in our small town. So he was always in town. My mom and my dad just basically took care of my daughter, and I went to school. I went to school at night. I worked. And so I just had significant support. So it really, I'm not sure it's any different today. You've still got those issues, but I really never had to have a babysitter. I had both my husband's parents and my parents, and just support.
And growing up here, I had family. My husband was with the police department for 30 years. And there were times back in the 60s when we had to work overtime and when we had to work weekends, because we had a deadline to meet. And of course, we all kind of...
You did work weekends or did not?
We did.
Okay.
We did.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of had to rotate it in and around our office staff because they also had children. But I was very fortunate to have my family live here, and I have one son, and my sister usually took care of him, but he was well taken care of, and I was able to work, whenever the time came around for us to do that. But there was a lot of overtime, and as well as interfacing with the city. My husband was with the city for 35 years, and I was with NASA for 45 years. That's how everybody got to know each other. We all even whatever your husband was involved in, you also supported them in their work environment, and if they had to do extracurricular activities or work overtime or what have you, you had to work within your husband's schedule as well. So it was just one of those things that you adapted to. And then our managers really treated us the very same way. You know, they were very respectful. A lot of the Germans and the Americans that worked together, they also had families too. And a lot of those early engineers didn't get to spend a lot of time with their families. But when they did, they worked hard and they played hard.
Teresa?
We're going to have to send some teams on their way. They've got rotations.
Gotcha.
As you leave, as you talk to these trainees, male and female, do you have advice or traits looking on a younger yourself that you would
Pass
give them
along.
as advice for a career?
Study hard.
Sure. And you do not have to be a scientist or an engineer. You do not have to be a scientist or an engineer to go to work for NASA or one of the government agencies. Like I said, back in the day, it wasn't required to have a degree. But today, in your day and age, you do have to have a degree. But you can also become a security specialist. You can become a procurement specialist, financial management. There's a lot of roles and positions that are available to you under those areas.
Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so I think it's really important. It would have been important for me to take better account of what I'm good at and try to do more of that rather than focusing so much on what I'm lacking at and trying to fix it. You need to do both.
So look at yourself internally and
Yeah.
ask others, what are my
Yes.
talents? What do I
Yes.
need to work on? What
Ask
do I need
others.
to build up?
And help your friends in the same way. Help each other.
So the advice I would give is to go after your dreams. You know, do what you really enjoy doing, and that way you don't feel like you're working. With all the years that I've worked, it really never felt like a job because I was part of something that was just so much bigger than me and what I was doing. It was a team effort.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would say is that is take control of your own future and don't expect somebody else to tell you what you should be doing. You need to, even when you get a job, you know, you don't wait for somebody to ask you to participate. You insert yourself and be assertive and taking control of what you want to do.
Go above and beyond what's required for you.
And I would say be courageous. You know, don't take the easy way out. Kind of challenge yourself and have the courage, even when you're fearful that maybe you can't do it. Ask someone to help you. Don't run from it because it's a challenge. Take the challenge, work hard, stretch.
Well, I came from a coal mining family, poor family, and my mother nor dad went to college, but they really thought education was the only way. I came to Redstone before NASA, came right out of college, 18 years old, too young to teach school, which is what my training had been, but studied mathematics. So I went to work for Roman Haas, a company, for 6 months and realized that the Army was really begging for mathematicians and engineers. I did not know any women that was working here as a mathematician when I came. They were what they call computers, which the mathematicians, we programmed with big sheets of columns of instructions as to what they would do. And they really were called officially math aides, but they were known as computers. They would actually take and do whatever we said do in a particular column. We coded these columns to solve the equations, and they would compute that for us so that we could analyze and decide what, the solution to the problem. I was the only mathematician at the time that I came to work for the Redstone Arsenal that I knew. They gave me a lot of publicity, very embarrassing, but they wrote me up for magazines and had pictures taken of my house and my family, and I'd only had a husband at that time. Yes, I worked for Doris Chandler. She had gone to Sophie Newcomb College. It was later, but not, and she was much, much smarter than I. So she came to work for Marshall. She even came to work for the Army before NASA came, but it was after I did. And she came not in the same section I was in, but in the Air Ballistics Laboratory. And she worked with me in developing the program, the targeting program for the Tactical Jupiter missile for the Air Force. So she was one of the brains. Nothing of this, as you know, is accomplished individually. We all work together, but she was one of the great contributors to. I did a job that normally a man would do, but I did it not because I was a woman. I did it because of the desire to work and to succeed. As a team worked, everyone worked. So it showed that equality was necessary, and I think laws were passed because of this.
How have you all been able to make a positive impact on STEM, on the world today?
I'll say we've, in Propulsion, have made it a priority the last several years to bring student interns in the summer. I think last summer we had over 70 interns, and our org is only 200 government workers, so we had about a third as many students with us for the summer, because we really feel that's important. And we also have been, the last several years, we've created something called a cooperative agreement notice, where we can more easily work with universities and send them work for undergrad or grad students to work in a lab on tasks that we need done at NASA. For a small investment on our part, we get a huge impact from the students. So we've been trying to both have interns in, mostly in the summer, but we have them all year round as well, and do more work with universities, because it's so important that we reach kids and try to get them excited about what we do and what is going on in STEM careers across the country.
So most recently, after I left NASA and went to NASA headquarters, I was chair of the board, Women in Aerospace, and then also Women in Aerospace Foundation, where we sponsored many scholarships, did a lot of events at schools, and I mean, that helps a lot. I was also the president of the National Space Club, and as part of that, we sponsor a lot of internships at Goddard Space Flight Center specifically. And then also I worked for a company, ATK, then Orbital ATK in Northrop Grumman. We do the space launch. We sponsor the Space Launch Initiative that's held here in Huntsville. And that is, I think, a significant event that helps many, many, many. You can reach so many students to get interested in flying rockets. You know, and I've done a lot of personal mentoring, but I think those things are, you know, make a big impact because you're reaching a lot more kids.
Sorry. I'm fairly active in the local section of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and we don't have a lot of money in our local section, but one thing that we really like to do is interact with the local sections of senior design classes and engineering schools, both at UAH, and we're trying to get a better cooperative agreement going with Alabama A&M. But we like to go in there and interact with those students. Some of our members, you know, including myself at times, we've been mentors for their design teams. We attend their design reviews and sometimes just kind of invite them to our meetings and get to know them and let them get involved with us. A little bit of exposure to what kind of all the different, those of us in engineering and STEM do, we think is very impactful.
So on the grade school level, I've judged science fairs. I have been featured speaker where I go and talk to maybe an entire fifth grade class and kind of encourage them about what I do. We might do a little experiment together, and I kind of show them what engineers do, what they can do. I've talked to, there's an organization called Delta Gems, which is for all girls. And I talked to them one Saturday morning, did a workshop about going into the STEM area. So I too focus, I've done some university visits, but I particularly like going back to the grade schools, junior high and elementary, because if you don't get them interested by the time they're in the fourth grade, You know, it's not when they're seniors, because they've missed the opportunities to take the higher level maths or the higher level sciences. So the place where I feel like we could have the greatest impact in terms of interesting boys or girls into STEM is in that elementary level. And sometimes it's hard for us as engineers to kind of explain what we do and break it down so that a first grader gets it or a second grader gets it. And so we kind of, you know, we shy away from those opportunities and say, I'll go work with UAH or I'll go work with Alabama A&M. But I think our challenge is to reach those elementary kids very early on and develop their love, you know, a natural love. For me, I had a natural love for math. I had an okay love for science, but I really liked math. And it was those teachers who kept saying, well, keep going, keep going, keep going. And so they just need someone to encourage them, keep going.
How many women were there at the very beginning when Marshall was formed? I mean, when you looked around in your departments, I'm just trying to get a general scheme of things. When it started, how many people look like you all? And then for you all who are still there, when you look around, what is that difference once you hear the response?
Well, there were, of course, a lot of secretaries, you know, and administrative type women in there. Almost all of the secretarial positions were women. So when I first went to Marshall, there were 6,000 people, and we went through 3 rifts. And, you know, ended up with, you know, around 3,000, which is where we've been, you know, since then. But there were, you know, in the project office, in the Saturn project office, there were no professional women. You know, I know there were some, Ann Whitaker and McNair, there were some engineers down in the laboratories, but in the project office, I mean, there were just none. And even in the late 80s, like 89, 90, there was only one SES at Marshall, one SES woman at Marshall, and she was a lawyer. So, I mean, think about that. That hasn't been that many years ago, and there were just
just 30 years from inception.
Yeah, there were just no women SESers. So when I was 15 and I was looking to get an SES, there weren't any, you know. A senior executive. So it ranks, it's like the stars for like a, you know, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star for the Army.
It's beyond the G scale, right?
Yes, it's beyond the G scale. So it ranks, you know, I retired as an SES 4, which was really ranked as like a 3-star general. And there were, you know, they're just, those jobs just, and it's not all NASA's fault, you know, because women had not gone into engineering fields. They didn't have, and the young people that we had hired after Challenger in the 86, when I hired in 65, and there were almost no hires until after Challenger. I mean, you were, you know, we had 6,000 people. We got down to 3,000 during that time. And a lot of it was attrition. We had 3 rifts, but most of it was attrition. So
that's reduction in force.
Yeah. So I'm sorry.
All the acronyms.
Yeah. But anyway, there weren't that many. We had not hired women engineers that could be coming up through the ranks, and so a lot of these ladies were the first ones that had been hired that were engineers.
And today, when you look around, ladies, those of you still employed?
I'll tell you, when I showed up, I was pleasantly surprised. You know, I left the Missile Defense Agency saying, I'm going to go work on rockets. And they're like, well, have fun with all those old guys, you know. And I was like, oh, okay. But I showed up, and, you know, one of the first people to greet me was a woman about 7 or 8 years older than me named Rachel. And our whole organization, mostly in engineering, in my experience, engineering is a little more diverse than perhaps the business areas still. And I wonder if that's kind of due to what you said, those of us kind of coming through the ranks are contributing to that a little bit. And as we move up into the business offices, that'll sort of change. But I have been pleasantly impacted that there are a lot of people that are like me of similar background.
And when you work for NASA, NASA's really family. Everybody takes care of themselves. Been friends with a lot of these people who are, you know, 50 and 60 years of friendship. And taking it back to your question about how the Space and Rocket Center, we have several of the docents. We have about 85 docents that go to all the schools and the colleges, and they participate in some of their STEM projects. We just went to Chaffee Elementary School on March the 30th, and I carried 25 docents with me that day. And they talked to all of the 5th grade class. They interviewed us, and they asked us, pointing questions about why did you go to work for NASA and what did you work on. And so we answered all of their questions, and then they invited us back on March the 30th. And they had built a little booklet on each one of us and had our story, had our picture. They made pictures of us that day. They had our picture there. They had a bulletin board with all of everyone's picture and their write-up. It was really touching to see how much that they wanted to hear from the old people and what you worked on. Yeah, the Saturn V and the Apollo days. I mean, those are some years that we really do cherish, and we love talking about them. And since I've come on board here, after I retired, they called me and wanted me to be the secretary to the Marshall Retirees Association. So then when Dr. Barnhart found out that I had access to about 300 emails and phone numbers, she wanted to implement the docent program here. She said that's been her dream. And that has been so beneficial over the last 4 years. People that come through just on a day-to-day basis, they love talking to anyone in those white coats that has that NASA meatball on the back. So they love, and now we have trading cards, sort of like baseball cards. So it has their former picture when they were here, when they worked at NASA years ago, and then a current picture of them in their lab coats. People collect those, and we get lots of feedback from everybody around the world after they have met these people who you actually worked on that Saturn V, you actually worked on the Apollo program or the shuttle program. And it involves our civil service and our contractor employees. And now we're really appealing to the people that are currently working. We are open, 7 days a week, 9 to 5, and you can fit in your schedule any time to come out and give an hour or 30 minutes or whatever the case may be. But because of all that focus, the schools are now calling us and wanting the docents to come and talk to them. So we really had a great time since we retired.
Empowering them.
Absolutely.
So you talked about retirement, but for you all still currently in the game, what's the future for women at Marshall? Where do you see yourself in the future? Where does Marshall fit into the big picture? And where do women fit into that?
Well, Marshall's right in the middle of the big picture right now. After the Vice President Pence made that recent speech where he says,
Charged you.
We're going to the moon in 2024. There is a lot to, and launching SLS in 2020, there is a lot to do. We are not bored at Marshall right now, that's for sure. And so we need all hands on deck, right, if we're going to accomplish those lofty goals. And it's fabulous to have, when you work for a government entity, you can have tragic things happen to you, like budget zeroed it out on Constellation unexpectedly, right, where you have to deal with it. And you can also have inspiring things happen to you, like vice presidents making speeches, giving you lofty goals. And we're luckily right now at an inspiring time. And so it's so energizing to be at work in an inspiring time, and there's opportunities for everybody. We were talking the other day, hey, we have summer interns coming. What projects do we need them to finish for us to help us get to landers in 2024? Let's make sure our assignments to those summer interns are meaningful, that help us get there, right? So we're really focused on helping accomplish those lofty missions, and Marshall Space Flight Center is right in the middle of all of those. So it's exciting.
Yeah, I ditto Mary Beth. I think the center has evolved. I mean, we have a center director that's a female now, so not only have we had, a couple of deputies. Well, hey, evolution, progress, you gotta love it, right? And so not only have we had deputy center directors that were females, we now have a female center director, and we have females operating on every level in the organization. And so I think the future is bright and getting brighter. And we're making history. And that's the thing we have to kind of, every now and then, we pinch ourselves, right? And we say, wow, when that rocket goes up, when they talk about Apollo, they talked about Ron Brown, right? Ron Brown. But when this SLS go up, they'll talk about the Mary Beths and the Lisas and the Angelas, right? Because we're making history. and we feel like, we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. It's an exciting time. We're going to do it. And I don't think people even look at gender. I find that the environment has evolved. It doesn't matter what your gender is. I don't think it matters what your ethnicity is as much. I think, can you contribute, right? Now we're looking for engage. Who's engaged? We need people to engage. We need people to contribute. And we don't care whether your English is broken. We just need to understand you, right? And we just, because it's the work, there's so much to do. There's not an opportunity. We can't afford to have anybody sitting in the corner, right? And so people who are in the corner now, managers are going and saying, what are you doing in this corner, right? Are you taking a break? Because if you're not, you need to be back in the game, right? So it's a different day in Marshall Space Flight Center, and I think it's a good day. And for women, it is an excellent day.
What's the biggest impediment? There must be some impediment to moving forward at a more rapid rate. What would that be? When it comes to STEM, when it comes to engineering, when it comes to aeronautics?
Sometimes I think our biggest impediment is we work for the government, right? I mean, there's just I don't mean that in a bad way. There's just there's great things about the government. When social change happens, they're out in the forefront of it. When women in the workplace, we're ahead. Where there's computers, we're ahead. But the detriment is when something goes wrong, we write 10 documents to make sure it never goes wrong again, right? And over the years, all that government bureaucracy, red tape, it makes it harder for us to hire people, or harder for us to write contracts, or harder for us to be agile, because the paperwork sometimes gets in our way. So we need to kind of think, when the Vice President Pence came here and challenged us about a new way of doing business, I really think that has to happen. And so our impediments is really some of the things that make working for the government the best, also makes working for the government hard.
Yeah, I agree, because, people talk about the government being risk adverse, right, and not being willing to step out there and take the risk. And I think part of that is that we try to learn our lessons from the previous things that have gone wrong and events, but you have to move past those sometimes to put yourself back out there, to be willing to be flexible and adaptable, and really sometimes you just have to take those additional risks, otherwise you get stagnant. And so I think that's the thing that we're really, that the agency is working towards now, and by having that new challenge that really gives us a drive, then we've got to put that aside, and we really have to move ourselves forward. Or if we're not successful at that, then we don't want to know what that looks like, right? So we want to make sure that we do have those successes. And so I think from the standpoint of the agency itself, it's learning the lessons, but not letting them hold us back, and let us continue to move forward and be successful again, and to be able to have some of the same memories as that we had in the Apollo and the shuttle, and all those days that are, when we look back on, those were the good old days. I used to say I would never say that, but you do when you've lived through them, right? And so you understand that more after you've lived through some of those times. And so we want to make those kinds of days and those kind of opportunities for the next generation, so that they are excited to want to come to work and send things to space.
You talked about budget limitations. You talked about other things that are restraining. But do you see change truly happening right now since the Vice President came to town? Have you been able to see real progress and rapid succession?
I definitely see change in the workforce, in the attitude of the people, in the passion. Not that people weren't passionate, not that people weren't excited about their job, but we're just more aligned maybe with a common goal. before maybe we were focused on too many things, and now we're, laser focused on a few less. So the workforce can change more rapidly. And we're talking about how do we do things. There were things done in Apollo, like, changing how we do procurements. During Apollo, they said, we're not going to follow all those rules. We're going to do things differently. So we're looking now in the programmatic arena about, can we do that same thing today?
What's old is new again.
What's old is new again.
And, I can probably speak from a contractor perspective because my company builds the solid rocket motors for the SLS. And we would become very frustrated because of the bureaucracy at NASA, where we would have maybe an issue on the solid rocket motor, and we would be satisfied that it was okay, but you really couldn't get it through SNMA and engineering and it almost felt like that. And, because I love my agency, I'm defending it, but it would almost be like there wasn't enough work at Marshall, so they didn't have enough to do in the engineering directorate or SNMA, and they were just diving down so deep, whereas in the Saturn program, you would never have done that. There just wasn't an urgency, and so people could drive, and Angela's going to probably disagree with me.
It looks good to me. Go. Looks good. Go.
No, I agree that we
Checks and
dive.
balances.
I think we dive deep, not though because we didn't have anything to do. We have lots to do. We've always had a mandate and a schedule. We should have flown already, right? So it wasn't they don't have anything to do, so they're digging deep. We were trained. Shuttle, you trained us to dig deep.
Yes, I did.
2 accidents trained us to dig deep, to be risk adverse, right? To take no chances, to make sure we got belts and suspenders, right? And so it's just a culture. You talked about change. That culture is changing. It has to change in order for us to get to 2020, right?
But how do you get past the point from even a local community, from a nation who says, we're not flying, we're still depending on the Russians? What are you all doing out there? Are you doing enough? How do you deal with that on a personal and professional level?
On a personal, professional level, I say, yeah, we're going to fly. Yes, we're moving. We have enough people in place. We have the people in place. We're making riskier decisions, and I say riskier from an earlier posture of low risk, right? Where we're saying maybe we don't need these tests, maybe we don't need as many tests, maybe we can say the design is good based on analysis alone. So we are rethinking the way we call something good enough. One of the things that Teresa in her, when she was in the director's office, weren't you there with, you were there with Rudy. Who you were there, Chris? Rudy.
We all were.
And then Chris. And one of the things that I remember Chris always preaching, you guys got to learn good enough engineering, right? You got to learn when to say it's good enough and stop. Stop polishing the rock. And so we are learning to stop polishing the rock, digging real deep, because the schedule is the mandate in the driver. I remember when we worked shuttle, the thing that kept us from going off kilter and what seemed like dragging our feet was because we had a launch date. We had an FRR that we had to meet, and so people felt this urgency. I got to get ready for the next
flight
mission.
readiness review.
Oh, I'm sorry, the flight readiness review, and getting ready for the next launch. So now we're feeling that air of we're getting ready to fly. It's back in the atmosphere at work, and so people are starting to say, maybe I don't need as much as I thought I need. I can take a little bit more risk. I can identify that risk to the project manager. It's his or hers to accept, but as engineers, we're ready to let it go now. Or as SNMA, I can partially speak for them. I've been away for a while, but.
So I'm in the middle of learning a little bit of all kinds of worlds. I'm detailed over into the booster element office right now, and I do love solid rocket motors. But one thing that I think we really need some force to push us over the hump of fear, because we do have a lot of the workforce that has experienced the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster. And while I haven't done, had those experiences myself, I've sat and talked with the people who have and understand to some extent, I know you can't really understand, but to some extent the scars that they carry from that. And certainly we don't want to repeat it. And so I think that's where a lot of the hesitancy and the digging really deep, at least currently, is coming from. But I'm really hoping that this new mandate helps give us just that little extra inertia to help us just get over the hump of that fear and figure out, like you were saying, Angela, what's good enough? What's good enough engineering?
I would add our computer tools are so much better than they were, well, certainly when I started. And so I think when we wrote some of our specs and standards and things we're trying to judge designs by today, they were written in a time where we didn't have the analytical capability we have today. And our new students we're hiring, they are all over doing analysis, and they can. They have phenomenal IT skills, and so I think we are re-looking at some of our specs and standards and documents we wrote in light of things like Challenger and Columbia, and said, hey, we wrote that back when we couldn't analyze very well, and things were pretty uncertain, and so we put big factors of safety on them because we didn't understand them well. But today, we can analyze things, and I can't even comprehend how many times better we can do our jobs. And we can run all kinds of Monte Carlo simulations, where you vary all the different parameters and say, hey, what if this is the worst thing, and this is the worst thing, and this is the worst thing, and this is the worst thing? And then you say, oh, well, I can survive all of those. And so maybe I don't need a safety factor of 2 anymore. Maybe because I can do all these computer simulations, maybe a safety factor of 1.25 or 1.4 is good enough. And safety factors are how we decide how much better than what's the minimally required the design should be. And so I think we are already starting, and we're going to have to keep re-looking at those documents we wrote after accidents, and what our skills and abilities were when those were written, and what they are today, because it's just a different day.
It is a different day, and it's so ironic that you brought this up last night. How many were here last night for astronaut Owen Garriott's memorial? Verbatim, what you all said just a few minutes ago. It was ironic. It was as if you were sitting in the front row. His dentist talked about a wonderful story, how he was so fastidious with his teeth, and he would come in frequently for his teeth cleanings, and he would even call and say, I got a problem with number 4. He got to be quite accomplished with his, what the numbers were with your teeth. And she told the story of how he would sit in the dental chair, and she would work on number 4, and he would get her to pull the tools out, and he would say, don't be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. You have to know when good enough is good enough. So I thought that was really wild that you brought that up right now in the same universe. Woo, okay. Yes, exactly. They're all aligning. We have about 8 minutes left, so I don't know if I've asked you everything that you would like to share with everyone, but I have a question. Who, as a little girl, did you envision yourself being versus who you became? And looking back, what would you tell that child today?
I can start because as an 11-year-old, I could just see myself working for Dr. von Braun and flying to the moon. I think I would love to have been an astronaut, but that wasn't even a thought at that point. But I can't, and in my wildest dream, I could not have imagined that I'd get to do everything that I got to do. I mean, when I went to work at NASA as a GS3, when I drove onto Redstone Arsenal, I had no idea what my career would be, but I would have been satisfied at that point to have stayed as a GS3 secretary forever if I could just get to work for NASA and work on the moon program. In my wildest imagination, I would never have thought that I would manage an external tank or be a deputy propulsion manager or get to work for a major aerospace contractor and have significant input and personally know all of these very famous, brilliant people, astronauts to very brilliant people. And Dr. Warner von Braun would walk in my office on the third floor of 4201 and say, "It's Frederick," and I work for Fred Doerr. And, you know, this man just was always floating around the center. We loved him. We loved what we did, and I loved what I did.
When I was a little girl, I'd never dreamed. NASA just never was in my world. I never thought about NASA, never dreamed about NASA. But that was this African-American teacher that taught math and lived in my community. And she was really smart. And not only did she do math, she did income taxes for people, right? She was the community
do-gooder.
Yeah, exactly. And her name was Miss Coleman. And so because I loved math, I thought I'll be a teacher like Miss Coleman. And I don't even know if she ever knew that I admired her, but she was my teacher, and I felt like prepared me for the higher math. It was 4th and 5th grade math that she was teaching. But I was one of the few students that when I graduated from high school had taken calculus, right, in high school, because of what Ms. Coleman had sown into my life as an elementary student. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to be Ms. Coleman.
Yeah, so I hate talking about this question because I had no, I knew I liked math. When I was a senior in high school, I had decided to go into college in engineering, mostly because I thought I'd try it out, and then if I didn't like it, I would change. Not because I had a desire to be an engineer, but I do remember my senior math teacher asking the class, "What are you all majoring in college?" And I went to a really small high school, and there were only like 6 people in this senior math class, and 3 of us said we're going to be engineers. And she said, "Oh, well, statistics said only one of the 3 of you were going to make it." And so I just looked at the other 2 guys and said, "Well, guess you guys are out." But it turned out all 3 of us became engineers. I still remember that. I tell that story sometimes because I think sometimes people say stuff like that and they don't really even think about what they're saying. But you can either take that as a confidence damper or a confidence booster, and you need to take those comments as a confidence booster. And so anyway, I never really dreamed of working for NASA. I grew up in Iowa. NASA wasn't big in Iowa. Van Allen went to Iowa, so I guess there was a little space there. The physics building was named Van Allen Building. But I kind of lucked into my job, and I love it. But I wouldn't, I knew I liked math, and I knew I wanted to do something with math, but I didn't really have a dream of working for NASA, but I can't now imagine any better career.
Yeah, I don't think I had any idea what I wanted to be. I did, like these other ladies, I loved math. I wasn't crazy about science, and everybody kept saying, you know, for an engineer you had to do math and science. Well, you do, but sometimes you can get by, which is what I did from the science perspective. But you know, I didn't really have a clue what I knew. My uncle, well, I came from a family that very strong women. And so I had lots of great role models of women who, you know, overcame lots of obstacles. And so, you know, I remember my mom and dad always telling me, whatever you decide you want to do, you can do. And so that encouragement, even when times were not so great in my first year in college, you know, that strong encouragement. But, you know, even when I went to work for NASA, which East Tennessee, we didn't know that much about NASA either. So I could have not even imagined the career that I would have had and the opportunities that I would have had. And, you know, it's just, when you sit back and dream, I couldn't have even dreamed close to the career that I ended up having. And so it's pretty phenomenal, and that's what I try to communicate, you know, to people is that, you know, just dream big, because you just never know what's out there for you. And I look back, and sometimes I kind of say, who is that person? That's not really me. Who is that they're talking about? So, but it's pretty fascinating and incredible career, and just incredible.
Any regrets?
Not a
Any
single
mistakes?
one.
Any do-overs, mulligans you wish you could take?
I couldn't have even dreamed. I couldn't have dreamed this, you know? I mean,
Study harder? And who would you be? Neither of you. Before we get to Lisa, nobody told me who they thought they were going to be as a child, if it weren't who you are today. You were going to be a math teacher. Lisa, did you?
I had a family. My parents had a family business, so I just assumed that I'd probably just go to work, you know, go get a degree, and then come back and, you know, do my thing there. I really don't know that I ever. Back then, you really didn't get the encouragement, and I say back then, that was a really long time ago. But you know, it's very different now. Nobody helped you with college applications. Nobody, they didn't really encourage you to go do that next step, and so you really had to do it on your own. And you know, even there was a lot of parents that didn't go to college or didn't know how, and didn't even know how to help you do that. So to think that we, you know, that to me, it's one of those things that it's like, oh my gosh, we really did it, and we did on our, you know, a lot of it just by encouragement and making mistakes.
we figured it out somehow.
Figured it out.
I completely veered off path. I was either going to be an airplane pilot or an artist. Neither one of those. We had a lot of hobby pilots in my family, but kind of as I grew up and figured out what I liked to do, I liked things that go fast and things that fly, and so what better way to fit into that than rockets, really, even though I never really thought of that.
Any final thoughts for each of you? Is there anything I didn't ask you you'd like to share?
No, just follow your dreams. You know, that's always my suggestion when I'm mentoring young girls or boys. And don't quit. You know, I mean, none of us got every job that we thought we deserved. You know, there were times when we applied for a job and we thought we should have had it and we didn't get selected. I'm sure that's true with everyone. And those people that I see that don't make it, they give up at that point and they get bitter and they say, well, you know, I deserve that job. You know, I think those of us who make it to the top of our potential of our careers keep pushing, and when we don't get the job we want, then we push harder, we work harder, and it's just like Angela says, you keep trying. And I think that is the difference in somebody that's successful, because every man doesn't get every job he thinks he deserves too. So you can't be the victim, you know, you can't let yourself be the victim. And like Teresa says, you've got to take control of your own career. I mean, I did that many times and changed jobs when I saw a dead end. I would change jobs. As a matter of fact, I got an SES that way by going to the National Space Science and Technology Center, out of Shuttle into the Science Directorate. So follow your dreams.
It is inspiring to see you all who have worked as a team for the last 60 years, from each generation, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, in an environment where today oftentimes you see not so much camaraderie, you see more competition. And it sounds like you truly had the Saturn sorority going for you back in the 60s, and that continued on to today.
And then back in the 60s, My school, my teacher who taught me typing and shorthand, they said to be everything that you can be and do it to the best of your ability, and God will reward you. So I am where God wants me to be, doing what God wants me to do, and receiving what God wants me to receive. And I've had a tremendous career, and I love being here at the Space and Rocket Center, reconnecting with everybody, and I appreciate everybody on the panel today. We have completed about 24 of those, and we have a few more to go. And it's been a pleasure working with everybody and reconnecting with everybody, and hearing these life stories are so meaningful. And I really wish the workforce of tomorrow could have what we have had in the past, because it's been a wonderful career.
I was just going to add about the teamwork. I think that is the best thing about working for the government, is that it is very much, we're all here to help each other. There's no, I mean, you might compete for a job, but you compete for a job with somebody and you go to lunch with them the next day. I mean, there's just really, it's really very much a team environment, and I think all the NASA centers are like that, not just ours. But I happen to think Marshall is extra special.
Well, having worked at Kennedy, they think the same way.
This concludes the 50th Apollo Marshall Spaceflight Women Then and Now series. So again, many, many thanks to you all for being here, sharing your insights. It'll be wonderful to see where you go from here. Your second act, or third act in some cases. So good luck to you all, and we will see you throughout the year. Best to you in your futures.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1, 0. We have commitment.